Of the virtue of justice as practiced by Most Holy Mary. The great virtue of justice is most necessary for the exercise of the love of God and man, and therefore also for all human conversation and intercourse. It is a habit by which the will is urged to give to each one what belongs to him, and its object matter is the just and equitable dealing which must be observed toward God. And as there are so many occasions in which man can exercise or violate this equity, and in so many different ways, the range of application of this virtue is very wide and diffused, and there are many different species or kinds of justice. In as far as it concerns the public and common good, it is called legal justice. In so far as it influences all the other virtues, it is called a general virtue, although it does not partake of the nature of the rest. In so far, however, as justice is employed for one determined object and by individuals to preserve the rights of each, it is called particular or special justice. This virtue in all its parts or kinds the Empress of Heaven exercised toward all creatures in an eminent degree, for she alone knew by her greater enlightenment, all its obligations and comprehended them perfectly. Although this virtue does not directly have anything to do with the natural passions, as is the case with fortitude and temperance, yet, in many instances, precisely on accounts of the failure to moderate and regulate the passions, justice towards the neighbor is set aside. This happens with those who out of disorderly covetousness or lust usurp what does not belong to them. But as in the Most Holy Mary there were no disorderly passions, nor any ignorance of proper measure to be maintained according to justice. She fulfilled all justice toward each person, and showed the way of justice to all who were privileged to hear from her mouth the words and doctrine of eternal life. As far as legal justice is concerned, she not only observed it to the letter by obeying the common laws, as she did in the purification and other prescriptions of the old law, although, on account of being the queen and free of sin, she was exempt from them, but no one except her most holy Son ever advanced so much as she the public and common good of morals. For toward this end she directed all her virtues and operations, earning thereby the divine mercy for mankind and benefiting her neighbor in many other ways. Also, the distributive and communicative justice belonged to Most Holy Mary in a heroic degree. Distributive justice regulates the distribution of the common goods to individual persons. This justice Her Highness observed in many affairs which were left to her authority and management in the primitive church, as for instance in the distribution of the common property for the sustenance and other necessities of each person. Although she never distributed money, for that she never handled, yet she gave her orders and at other times her counsel for its just application. Excuse me. On these On these and similar occasions, she always acted up to strict equity and justice, according to the necessities and circumstances of each one's condition. The same she also observed in the distribution of offices and ministerial dignities among the apostles and the first children of the church in their meetings and assemblies. All these things this most wise teacher ordered and arranged with perfect equity, for besides her ordinary knowledge and insight into the dispositions of each of her subjects, she made use of prayer and of the divine enlightenment. On this account the apostles and others whom she governed had recourse to her for direction and counsel, and whatever was done under her direction was disposed of in perfect equity and without acceptation of persons. Communicative justice procures reciprocal equality in that which is given and received by individuals, as for instance, observing the rule to offer gift for gift, etc., or value for value. This kind of justice the Queen of Heaven had fewer opportunities of exercising than other virtues, for she never bought or sold anything for herself. If it was necessary to buy or commute any article, it was done by the patriarch St. Joseph while he lived, and afterwards by St. John the Evangelist or some of the apostles. The Master of Sanctity, who came to destroy and eradicate avarice, 1 Timothy 6:10, the root of all evil, wished to remove from himself and from his most holy mother all those negotiations and transactions in which the fire of human covetousness is enkindled and preserved. Therefore his providence ordained that neither his own hand nor that of his purest mother should be soiled by the transactions of human commerce in buying and selling, even if only of things necessary for the preservation of human life. However, the Queen did not omit to teach men this virtue of communicative justice, directing in the way of perfect justice all those who in the apostolate and primitive church were engaged in such affairs. This virtue of justice comprises also other kinds of activity in regard to the neighbor, such as judging others in the public and civil courts or in private. Our Savior refers to the contrary vice when he says in St. Matthew, quote, "Judge not that you may not be judged," unquote, Matthew 7:1. These judgments are formed by each one according to the estimate which is in his own mind. Therefore they are just judgments, as if they are conformable to reason, and unjust if they disagree with it. Our sovereign Queen never exercised the office of a public or civil judge, although she had the power to be the judge of all the universe, but by her most equitous counsels during the time of her life and afterwards through her intercession, she fulfilled what was written about her in the Proverbs. Quote, "I walk in the paths of justice, and through me the mighty decree justice." Unquote. Proverbs 8:20-16. Excuse me. Boy. Bad allergy day. As regards particular judgments, no injustice could ever find a place in the most pure heart of Most Holy Mary, for she could never be imprudent in her suspicions or rash in her judgments, nor was she troubled by doubts, nor, if she had any, would she ever decide them unkindly for the worst part. These vices of injustice are proper and natural, as it were, to the children of Adam, who are dominated and enslaved by the disorderly passions of hate, envy, ill-natured emulation, and other evil inclinations. From these bad roots sprout unjust suspicions with slight foundations, rash judgments, and prejudiced solution of doubts, for each one easily presumes in his brother his own faults. Because they are filled with hate and envy at the prosperity of their neighbor and rejoice at his misfortune, they lightly give belief where there are no grounds, only yielding to their bad desires and allowing their judgments to drift in accordance with their wishes. From all these consequences of sin our Queen was free, for she had no part in sin. All was charity, purity, sanctity, and perfect love. Whatever entered or came from the sanctuary of her heart, in her was all the grace of truth and the way of life. Ecclesiastes 24:25. In the plenitude of her sanctity and science she doubted nothing, she suspected nothing, for she was aware of all the secrets hidden in the hearts of men and searched their souls with the light of truth and mercy, not suspecting evil and never attributing blame where none was due. On the contrary, she was solicitous to excuse the sins of men, in justice and equity yielding to each and every one his dues. Her most earnest desire was to fill all men with the sweetness and the graciousness of her virtues. In the two different kinds of communicative and distributive justice, there are contained many other kinds or species of virtues, but I will only refer to them in so far as to say that all of them, both as habits and as acts, were possessed by the Most Holy Mary in the highest and most excellent degree. Some of these virtues are related to justice because they are exercised in our intercourse with our neighbor and partake to a certain extent, though not in all their bearings, of the nature of justice, either because we are unable to pay fully what we owe, or because, if we are able, the debt or obligation is not so strict as that which is incurred by commutative or distributive for justice. I will not enter upon a full explanation of these virtues, since they are various and numerous, but in order not to pass them over entirely, I will give a short summary, so as to show how our sovereign and most high princess was adorned with all of them. It is a just obligation to give worship and reverence to those who are placed above us, according to the greatness of their excellence and their dignity, and according to the benefits which we receive at their hands. Varies also our obligation and reverence which we owe them, although no return on our part can equal the benefit or the dignity. The first virtue of this kind is that of religion, by which we give to God due worship and reverence, though his magnificence and his gifts exceed infinitely all that we will ever be able to return in thanks or praise. Among the moral virtues, this one is the most noble, on account of its object, namely the worship of God, and its subject matter is as extensive as there are ways and means of directly praising and reverencing God. In this virtue of religion are comprehended all the interior acts of prayer, contemplation, and devotion, with all their parts, conditions, causes, effects, and purposes. Among exterior actions, latria, which is the supreme outward adoration due only to God, falls under this head, and with it also its different kinds of parts, namely sacrifices, oblations, tithes, and vows, oaths, exterior and vocal offerings of praise. For in all these actions, if they are performed in the proper manner, God is honored and reverenced by the creatures, just as he is very much offended in the contrary vices. The second virtue falling under the above class is piety, by which we are inclined to honor our parents, to whom after God we owe our being and our education. By it we also show proper regard for those who participate in a manner of the quality of parents, such as, for instance, our relatives or our country, which sustains and governs us. This virtue is so important that we must prefer its dictates to the acts of supererogation in the virtue of religion. Boy, that's a tough one. So Christ the Lord teaches us in St. Matthew, when he reprehended the Pharisees for setting aside piety toward their parents under the pretext of the worship of God. In the third place must be mentioned veneration, which inclines us to give honor and reverence to those who possess some superior excellence or dignity of a different kind from that of our parents or fatherland. This virtue the doctors divide into two kinds, dulia and obedience. Dulia is the veneration due to those who participate to a certain measure in the majesty and dominion of the highest Lord God, to whom is due, as we said above, the worship of adoration or latria. Therefore we honor the saints by the reverence called dulia, and likewise those in the higher dignities, to whom we subject ourselves as servants. Obedience is the subjection of our will, inducing us to do the will of our superior in preference to our own. Our free will is so estimable that this virtue is admirable and excellent above all the moral virtues, for the sacrifice is greater than in any other. Excuse me. These three virtues of religion, piety, and veneration, observantia, were possessed by Mary in such great plenitude and perfection that nothing possible pertaining to them was wanting. What intellect can ever comprehend the honor, veneration, and worship with which this lady served her most beloved Son, adoring him as true God and man, as Creator, Redeemer, Glorifier, the highest, the infinite, the immense in essence, in goodness, and in all her attributes. She knew more of him than any other creature, and more than all of them together, and according to her knowledge she rendered due honor, teaching even the seraphim how to reverence him. In this virtue she was so great a teacher that merely to see her was sufficient to rouse, urge, and incite all by a secret force to worship the Supreme Lord and Author of heaven and earth, and without any other effort on her part she induced many to praise God. Her prayers, contemplations, and devotions, together with the wonderful effects and the power of her intercession, are known to all the angels and saints, but cannot be comprehended by them, exciting their endless admiration. To her all the intellectual creatures are indebted, since she satisfied and made recompense not only for that which they have culpably neglected in this regard, but also for that which they could never attain or execute or merit. This lady outtraced the salvation of the world, and if she had not been in it, the eternal Word would not have issued from the bosom of the Father. She excelled the seraphim from her first instant in contemplation, in prayer, in petition, and in devout promptitude for the service of God. She offered the proper sacrifice, gave oblations and tithes, and all this in such a perfect manner that nothing on the part of men was more acceptable next to that of her most holy Son. In the ceaseless praise, hymns, canticles, and vocal prayers which she offered, she was above all the patriarchs and prophets, and if in the church militant her doings were known as in the church triumphant, they would be the admiration of the world. The virtues of piety and veneration her Majesty exercised in proportion as she knew how to estimate better her obligation towards her parents and their heroic sanctity. The same was true in regard to her relations. For instance, she procured special graces for John the Baptist and his mother, for holy Elizabeth, and some others in the apostolate. Certainly, if her fatherland had not been made unworthy of favor by the ingratitude and hard-heartedness of its inhabitants, she would have made it the most fortunate country on earth. Nevertheless, in as far as the Most High permitted, she conferred upon it the great benefits and favors, both spiritual and material. In reverence toward the priests, she was admirable, for she alone knew that and could set proper value on the dignity of the anointed of the Lord. She has taught us all in this matter, and also how to honor the patriarchs, prophets, and saints, as well as the temporal masters and those in authority. She omitted no act pertaining to these virtues, being solicitous according to time and opportunity to instruct others in the exercise of them, especially the first faithful in the establishment of the evangelical church. There, obeying not any more the verbal commands of her most holy Son, or of her husband, but submitting to her Son's substitutes, she became an example to the world of a new kind of obedience. For in those times, not she owed obedience to any creature, but the whole earth, in an especial manner, owed obedience to her, since she was staying upon it as its queen and mistress for the very purpose of governing it. There are other virtues which can also be classed under the head of justice, for they dispose us to yield to others that which we owe them on account of some moral obligation founded upon an honest and just title. These virtues are gratitude or thankfulness, truth or veracity, vindication, liberality, friendship, or affability. By gratitude we create a certain equality of ourselves with those from whom we have received benefits, giving them thanks in return, according to the nature of the benefits and the kindness with which they were bestowed, which after all is the most valuable part of the benefit. The grateful also take into account the position and dignity of the benefactor. Gratitude bears in mind all these elements, can be manifested in different ways. Veracity inclines us to be truthful in all our intercourse, as is proper in human life and conversation, avoiding all lying, which is never allowed, deceitful simulation, hypocrisy, boastfulness, and irony. These vices are all opposed to truth, and though it is possible and even advisable to minimize when we are speaking of our own excellence or virtue in order not to offend by boasting, yet it is not right to do so by telling a falsehood, imputing vice to ourselves untruthfully. Vindication is a virtue which teaches us to recompense or make up for damage done by ourselves or by the neighbor, satisfying for it by some punishment. Among mortals the practice of this virtue is difficult, for they are so much more moved by immoderate anger and dislike of their brethren, and so tardy in charity and justice. This vindication of the particular or general well-being is no unimportant virtue. Christ our Lord made use of this virtue when he expelled from the temple those who desecrated it by their irreverence. John 2:15. Elias and Eliseus drew down fire from heaven in order to chastise some sins. And in the Proverbs it is said, quote, "He that spareth the rod hateth his son," unquote. Proverbs 13:24. Liberality and generosity serves to distribute in a reasonable manner money or other goods, without falling into the vices of prodigality or niggardliness. Friendship or affability consists in conversing and acting in a decent and becoming manner toward all, without quarreling or flattery, which are the vices opposed to friendship. None of these virtues, nor any others which might be related to justice, were wanting to the Queen of Heaven. For all these she had the habit and practiced them as occasion offered. Moreover, as the teacher and mistress of all sanctity, she instructed and enlightened many souls how they were to exercise and practice them with the greatest perfection. The virtue of gratitude toward God she exercised by acts of religion and worship, as we have already described, for this is the best way to show our gratitude toward him, and as the dignity of the most pure Mary and her concomitant sanctity was exalted above all created understanding, this eminent mistress gave a return of gratitude proportionate to his benefits, within the measure possible to a creature. The same holds true in regard to her piety toward her parents, her country, as mentioned above. To her fellow men, this most humble princess returned thanks for each favor as if she deserved no consideration from anyone, and although all favors were due to her injustice, she nevertheless gave thanks for them with gracious affability. She alone knew and practiced this virtue to such an extent as to return thanks for injuries and offenses as if they were great benefits. For in her incomparable humility she never recognized anything as an injury, and considered herself under obligation for what really were such. Moreover, as she never forgot any benefit, she also never ceased in her gratitude. About the truthfulness of Mary, Our Lady, little need be said, since she who was so superior to the demon, the father of lies and deceit, could not tolerate even the shadow of that despicable vice. The standard by which the virtue of truthfulness is to be measured in our Queen is her dove-like charity and simplicity, which excluded all duplicity or deceit in her intercourse with creatures. And how could the guilt of deceit be found in the mouth of that lady who, with one word of truest humility falling from her lips, drew down to her womb that one who is essential truth and holiness? In regard to the exercise of the virtue called vindication, the Most Holy Mary likewise was proficient, not only instructing others as a teacher during the time of the first beginnings of the evangelical church, but zealously advancing the honor of the Most High and trying to convert many sinners through fraternal correction, as was the case in regard to Judas many times, and commanding the creatures, which were obedient to her wishes, to punish some of the sinners in order that they might be converted and be saved from the eternal punishment due to their sins. Although on these occasions she was most sweet and kind in her punishments, yet she did not remit them, whenever necessary, to secure an effective cleansing from sin. Most of all, however, did she exercise retribution toward the demon in order to free the human race from his slavery. The sovereign queen practiced also the most exalted liberality and friendliness. Her generosity in giving and distributing was on a scale befitting the empress of all creation, and one who knows the proper value of all the invisible and visible things. This lady never possessed anything of her own that she did not consider just as much the property of her neighbor as hers, nor did she ever deny anything to anybody, not even waiting till they should pay the price of asking for it, whenever she could be beforehand in giving. The poverty and miseries which she alleviated, the benefits which she bestowed, the mercies which flowed from her, even as regards only temporal matters, could not be recounted in an immense volume. Her amiable friendliness toward all creatures was so singular and admirable that if she had not concealed it with rare prudence, she would have drawn to herself all the world, entranced by her most sweet intercourse, her mildness and kindness, though tempered by a divine seriousness and wisdom, displayed in her intercourse the marks of superhuman excellence. The Most High himself regulated this perfection in her, allowing at times some of the signs of the sacrament of the King to show themselves, but taking care that the veil should fall immediately and again conceal the mystery beneath earthly labors, thus forestalling the applause of men. All their honors were far below that which she deserved, and men would never be able to attain, and would fall either below or exceed the correct measure of honor due to one who was at the same time a creature and the mother of God. This was reserved for the time when, as children of the Church, men should be enlightened by the Catholic faith. For the adequate and perfect exercise of this great virtue of justice, the doctors point out another part or aid to it, which they call epikeia, which gives us in some affairs that are above the common and ordinary rules and laws, which guides us in some affairs that are above the common and ordinary rules and laws. For not all affairs, with their varying circumstances, can be covered by the ordinary laws, and therefore it is necessary to proceed on certain occasions by the light of a superior and extraordinary reasoning. This part of justice the sovereign queen practiced on many occasions during her life, both before and especially after the ascension of her only begotten Son. In order to regulate the affairs of the primitive church, as I will say in its place, she often made use of epikeia as required by the interests of the Most High. Instruction vouchsafed by the Queen of Heaven. In this extensive virtue of justice, my daughter, although thou hast been taught much of its value, thou still art ignorant of the greater part of it on account of thy condition in this state of mortality, and therefore also this thy account of it is insufficient for a full understanding of its excellence. Nevertheless, thou hast in it a copious summary to direct thy intercourse with creatures and thy worship of the Most High. In regard to this latter, I remind thee, my dearest, that the supreme majesty of the Omnipotent is highly indignant at the offenses of mortals, who forget the veneration, adoration, and reverence due to him. If some of them do render it, it is so coarse, inattentive, and discourteous that they do not merit reward but chastisement. They revere and adore profoundly the princes and magnates of the earth. Magnates of the earth. They ask favors and seek to obtain them with the utmost diligence. They are effusive in their thanks when they succeed, protesting their lifelong gratitude. But the Supreme Lord, who gives them being, life, and activity, who preserves and sustains them, who has redeemed them and raised them to the dignity of sons, who wishes to confer upon them his own glory, who is in himself the infinite and the highest good, him, the highest majesty, they forget, because they cannot see him with their corporal eyes. As if not all good came from him, they return, at the highest, merely a sluggish remembrance and a hasty thanksgiving. I will not even mention at present how much those offend the most just ruler of the universe, who wickedly break through and overturn all the order of justice toward their neighbor, perverting the whole natural order and wishing their brothers what they would not wish for themselves. Abhor, my daughter, such execrable conduct, and as far as thy forces will allow, make up by thy works for this want of acknowledgment in the service of the Most High. And as by the state of life thou art consecrated to the divine worship, let that be thy principal occupation and delight, striving to imitate the angelic spirits in their ceaseless fear and worship of the Lord. Preserve reverence for holy things, including also the ornaments and sacred vessels used in divine service. During divine office, prayer, and sacrifice, see that thou remain on thy knees. Implore with faith and receive his favors with humble thanksgiving. The same consideration thou shouldest show also to all men, even if they offend thee. To all be kind, affable, meek, simple, and truthful, without deceit or double dealing, without detraction or ill will, without rash judgment of thy neighbor. And in order that thou mayest fulfill all justice, revive the memory of it constantly, and desire to do to thy neighbor that which thou wishest done to thyself. Especially remember how my most holy Son and I, in imitation of him, acted toward all men. The virtue of fortitude is practiced by the Most Holy Mary. The virtue of fortitude, which is the third of the four cardinal virtues, serves as to moderate the personal activity of each one's choleric affections. Although it is true that concupiscence precedes irascibility, and therefore temperance, which regulates concupiscence, might seem to precede fortitude, because the resistance pertaining to fortitude is exerted against that which opposes concupiscence. Nevertheless, we must first treat of the activity of the choleric affections and their moderation through fortitude. For in the pursuit of that which is desired, success ordinarily depends upon the intervention of the irascible faculties for overcoming the obstacles that present themselves. Therefore, fortitude is a more noble and excellent virtue than temperance, of which we shall treat in the following chapter. The moderation of the irascible passions by the virtue of fortitude is made up of two elements or kinds of activity: to give way to anger in conformity with reason, propriety, and honor, and to repress unreasonable anger and passion whenever it is more useful to restrain than to allow them to act. For as well as the one as the other can be praiseworthy or blamable according to the end in view and the circumstances or the affair at hand. The first of these two kinds of operations of this virtue is properly called fortitude, being called by some teachers pugnacity, bellicositas. Wow, that's a new one. The second is called patience, which is the more noble and excellent kind of fortitude, and which is possessed and exercised principally by the saints. The worldly minded, throwing aside good judgment and usurping a false term, are apt to call patience pusillanimity, and miscall inconsiderate and rash presumption fortitude. Thus it comes that they never attain the true practice of the virtue of fortitude. In Most Holy Mary there were no inordinate movements which could call to activity the irascible affections for the exercise of fortitude. For in the most innocent Queen all the passions were well ordered and subject to reason, and her reason was subject to God, who governed her in all her actions and movements. But she was in need of this virtue in order to overcome the obstacles placed by the devil in diverse ways, seeking to prevent her from attaining what she most prudently and most properly desired for herself and her most holy Son. And in this most valiant resistance, and conflict, none of the creatures ever showed more fortitude, for no one ever encountered such conflicts and opposition as she from the demon. But whenever it became necessary to make use of this kind of fortitude or pugnacity with human creatures, she was equally sweet and forcible, or rather, she was just as irresistible as she was most sweet in her activity. For this heavenly lady alone among all creatures was able to copy so faithfully in her operations that attribute of the Most High which unites irresistible power with heavenly sweetness. Wisdom 8:1. Thus our queen proceeded in her actions with fortitude, knowing no disorderly fear in her generous heart, as she was superior to all creation. Neither was she rash, or audacious, or immoderate, being alike removed from all these vicious extremes, for in her great wisdom she knew that terrors were to be vanquished. She knew what terrors were to be vanquished, and what rashness was to be avoided. Thus she was the chosen woman, clothed in the strength of fortitude and beauty. Proverbs 31:25. That part of fortitude which consists in patient endurance, Most Holy Mary practiced in a still more admirable manner, for she alone participated in the excellent patience of her Most Holy Son, who bore punishment and suffered innocently without guilt, and in a greater measure than all those who had contracted the guilt. The whole life of the Sovereign Queen was a continual suffering and tribulation, especially during the life and passion of our Redeemer, Jesus Christ. Her patience during this time exceeds the comprehension of all creatures, and only the Lord who imposed this suffering upon her could worthily understand its greatness. Never was this most pure dove excited to the least impatience against any creature, nor did any of the immense tribulations and sorrows of her life seem great to her, nor was she ever dejected on account of them, nor did she fail to accept them all with joy and gratitude. If, according to the Apostle, the first requisite of charity, and as it were, its firstborn, is patience, 1 Corinthians 13:4, and if our Queen was the mother of love, Proverbs 24:24, then she was also the mother of patience, for her love is the measure of her patience. For in the degree in which we love and esteem the eternal good, and we should esteem it above all visible things, in that degree we will be ready, in order to obtain it and avoid the loss of it, to suffer all hardships in patience. Hence Most Holy Mary in her love was patient beyond all that is created, and she was the mother of patience for us. Flying to her protection, we shall find the Tower of David with its 1,000 shields of patience pending from it, Canticles 4:4, with which the brave ones of the Church and of the militia of Christ our Lord arm themselves for battle. Our most patient Queen was never affected by the caprices of feminine inconstancy, nor indulged in outward signs of anger. All this she restrained by the aid of divine light and wisdom, although these latter did not do away with pain, but rather augmented it, for no one could recognize the infinite misfortune of sins and offenses against God as this lady. But even so, her invincible heart could not be disturbed. Neither the malice of Judas nor the injuries and insults of the Pharisees could ever cause signs of anger in her exterior. Although at the death of her most holy Son, all the insensible elements and creatures seemed to have lost patience toward mortals, not being able to suffer the injuries and offenses done to their Creator, Mary alone remained unmoved and ready to receive Judas, all the Pharisees and high priests who crucified Christ, if they had chosen to return to this mother of piety and mercy. It is true that, without thereby passing the bounds of reason or virtue, the most meek Queen could justly have been indignant and angry at those who delivered over her most holy Son to such a frightful death, for the Lord himself punished this sin in his justice. While following up this thought, I was informed that the Most High provided against these movements and kept her free from all motions and affections of anger, though they would not have been unjust, for he wished to prevent her from being the accuser of these sinners, because he had chosen her as the mediatrix and advocate, the mother of mercy. Through her were to flow all the mercies which he wished to grant to all the children of Adam. He wished her to be the one creature that could worthily intercede for sin and temper the wrath of the just judge. Solely against the demon, the anger of this lady was given free scope. Also, insofar as this passion was necessary to exercise patience and forbearance and to overcome the impediments with which this enemy and ancient serpent obstructed her beneficent course. To this virtue of fortitude belong also magnanimity and magnificence, because they in manner partake of the nature of this virtue by giving firmness to the will in matters relating to fortitude. Magnanimity consists in pursuing great things and thus striving after the great honors of virtue. Its subject matter is therefore great honorableness, from which arise many qualities particular to the magnanimous, as for instance to abhor flattery and the pretenses of hypocrisy, for to love these is the part of small and mean souls. Not to be covetous, selfishly looking only for usefulness, but rather to seek honorable and great things, to speak little of oneself, not to brag, and not to be easily taken up by small things, and not to avoid the greater undertakings, to be more inclined to give than to receive, for all these are worthy of honor. But this virtue is not on this account opposed to humility, for one virtue cannot be opposed to another. Magnanimity causes us to use our gifts and virtues in such a way as to merit the greater honor, without at the same time seeking honor anxiously and unreasonably. Humility, on the other hand, teaches us our relation to God in the smallness of our desert caused by our defects, and our own lowly nature. I'm not sure how that's used there. On account of the special difficulties connected with great and noble undertakings, fortitude, especially the fortitude called magnanimity, is necessary. This proportions our forces to the execution of great works, neither allowing us to desist from them in pusillanimity, nor to attempt them with presumption, disorderly ambition, or vainglory, for all these vices magnanimity abhors. Magnificence similarly points to the execution of great deeds, and in this signification it may enter into the perfection of every virtue, for in all virtues great things may be undertaken. But as there is a special difficulty in great outlays or sacrifices, magnificence more particularly is that virtue which inclines us to make great sacrifices in a prudent manner, so that there be neither niggardliness, which much is required, nor profuseness, where there is no need, wasting and destroying without necessity. Although this seems to be the same virtue as liberality, yet the philosophers distinguish one from the other. Magnificence regards only the greatness of the cost, without attending to other circumstances, whereas liberality regulates the temperate love and use of money. One can therefore be liberal without being magnificent, as liberality may stop short of its course when there is question of great and important favors. These virtues of magnanimity and magnificence were possessed by the Queen of Heaven in a manner unattainable by others capable of these virtues. Mary alone found no difficulty or hindrance in accomplishing great things, and she alone did everything on a grand scale, even though the matter was small in itself. She alone understood the full bearing of these virtues, as she did of all the rest. She could give them their full perfection without gauging them by any contrary inclinations, nor was she ignorant of the perfect manner of exercising, nor of making them dependent upon the assistance of other virtues. For this is wont to happen with most holy and prudent men, who, when they cannot attain entire perfection in all virtue, choose that which seems to be the best of them. In all her practice of virtues, this lady was so magnanimous that she always performed that which was most excellent and worthy of honor and commendation. Yet though she deserved honor and praise from all creatures, she was nevertheless most magnanimous in despising it and referring it to God alone, and she preserved her humility while practicing the highest perfection of virtue. The acts of her heroic humility stood, as it were, in heavenly rivalry with the magnanimous excellence of all her other virtues, and were like richest jewels, set in contrast with the beauteous variety of excellences that adorned the daughter of the king, whose glory, as David her father had said, Psalms 44:14, is all from within. Also, in magnificence our queen greatly excelled, for although she was poor and without any affection toward earthly things, nevertheless she dispensed most freely those things which the Lord furnished her, as happened with the precious gifts which the Magi offered to the child Jesus, and many times afterwards in the course of her life, after the Lord had ascended to heaven. As mistress of all creation, she also showed her great magnificence by willingly yielding the whole of it for the common benefit and for the honor of the worship of God. Many she instructed in this doctrine and virtue, which, on account of their vile customs and inclinations, mortals practice with so much difficulty, and in which they can never reach the proper perfection of prudence. Commonly, mortals follow their inclinations and desires, seeking only the honor and emoluments of virtue, and to be esteemed as great and extraordinary. The honor and glory of virtue is thus diverted from the Lord by their wrongful hankering, and consequently, when any occasion presents itself for the performance of a magnanimous and generous deed, they shrink back and fail to execute it on account of the littleness and meanness of their sentiments. As their desire of seeing great, excellent, and worthy of admiration nevertheless remains, they have recourse to other means proportionably deceitful and really vicious, such as getting angry, showing arrogance, impatience, haughtiness, dislike, and boastfulness. However, these vices are not a part of magnanimity, but of smallness and meanness of heart. Hence, as such conduct and sentiments repel rather than attract honor, they do not gain the honor and esteem of the wise, but contempt and abhorrence. Instruction vouchsafed by the Queen of Heaven. My daughter, if thou seekest attentively to obtain a full understanding of the excellence and the propriety of the virtue of fortitude, as is my wish, thou shalt come into the possession of a most efficient check for the guiding of thy irascible affections, for these are the passions which are most easily moved to action and are most apt to overstep the bounds of reason. Thou shalt also have the means of attaining to the utmost greatness and perfection of virtue which thou desirest, and of resisting and overcoming all the machinations of thy enemies who seek to intimidate thee in the pursuit of what is hard in perfection. But understand, my dearest, that the irascible in thy nature assists the concupiscible by opposing what is hostile to the object sought after by the concupiscible powers. On this account, the irascible will deteriorate much faster than the concupiscible. As soon as the concupiscible affections become disordered and begin to love what is only apparently good or what is vicious, in place of a virtuous fortitude, many execrable and deformed vices will then result. This will also teach thee that disorderly love of one's own excellence and distinction and vainglory, which are the sources of pride and vanity, will breed many vices, particular to the irascible passions, such as discords, contentions, quarrels, boasting, strife, impatience, obstinacy. Moreover, also vices peculiar to the concupiscible passions, such as hypocrisy, lying, vain strivings, curiosity, and the desire to appear more than is befitting to a creature, and to conceal the meanness which truly belongs to one who has committed sins. From all these contemptible vices thou shalt keep thyself free, if thou wilt earnestly mortify and restrain the inordinate movements of concupiscence by virtue of temperance, which I will now teach thee. For when thou strivest after that which is just and useful, although thou make use of fortitude and of the well-ordered irascible passions, it must always be done in such a way as not to pass the proper bounds, and there is continual danger of allowing oneself to be carried away by inordinate zeal for virtue, when one is subject to self-love or any disorderly love. Sometimes this vice disguises itself and hides under the cloak of a pious zeal, and its victims, anxious to appear zealous for God and the good of their neighbor, are in reality deceived and ensnared into anger by selfish motives. On this account, the patience which is founded in charity and which is accompanied by generosity and magnanimity is very honorable, estimable, and necessary. For he that really loves the highest and truest good easily bears the loss of apparent honor and glory, despising it with magnanimity as vile and contemptible. Even when it is freely given by his fellow creatures, the magnanimous will set no value on it. He will show himself invincible and constant in all his undertakings. Thus he will advance, according to his opportunities, in the virtues of perseverance and patience. May God bless and keep you. Praise be to Jesus Christ.